So today we're going to be talking about weight-sensitive stress systems. And we already looked at one of these in Latin earlier in the semester when we did our syllabicity unit. So it might be worth going back to take a look at that handout. We're going to see some very similar patterns today. Um, the weight sensitivity phenomenon, right? The reason why we talk about heavy and light syllables or quantitative stress systems or quantity sensitive stress systems is based on the observation that in some kinds of languages, not everyone, so we've been looking at quantity insensitive systems so far in this handout, but in some languages, it looks like stress changes location based on what kinds of segments are in different syllables. And in particular, we see across languages a tendency for stress to be attracted to certain kinds of syllables that are in some sense bigger than others. And the particular sense in which these syllables are bigger are not, it's not necessarily any kind of phonologically or phonetically unified set of features. Instead, it seems to be structural in the following sense. So what counts as being a big syllable or as a heavy syllable in many of these languages, it's going to be either one with a long vowel, or in some languages, one with coda consonants, or in some languages, it's going to be a syllable that ends with a high sonority consonant, like a liquid or a nasal, but not an obstruent in some languages. In other languages, all the consonants behave the same. But because there's no real featural unity to these, we don't have a feature that says, hey, this syllable ends with either the second half of a long vowel or the first half of a geminate consonant, or some kind of a coda consonant that can't be parsed into the next syllable, or some kind of a high sonority coda consonant that can't be parsed into the next syllable. We don't really have a feature for that. And so we talk about this as a structural factor of having extra stuff in the syllable. And the unit of stuff here is what we refer to as a mora in phonological theory, where all that mora really means is, hey, there's a unit of thing that counts for syllable weight, and these items carry that unit, and these items don't. So we would say that long vowels are bimoraic. They have two moras in them. A short vowel has one mora, and in some languages, depending on language-specific patterns and contrasts, some coda consonants or all coda consonants, or maybe the first half of a geminate consonant, also carry a mora and are parsed in the preceding syllable. So this is how we talked about syllable weight. We refer to the stress-attracting syllables as heavy, and as the other syllables that don't attract stress, we refer to them as light. And so this is most well attested in stress systems, this pattern of weight sensitivity. But one of the reasons why we use mora theory and weight sensitivity as a general structural phenomenon is because it also shows up in certain kinds of other phonological patterns that we're not going to talk about in here this semester, but that include things like where are contour tones licensed, or how big does a word have to be to count as a word, or things like that. So we find weight showing up in a variety of phonological systems, but we're going to focus on stress here. So we looked at a system like this in Latin. And in Latin, we came to a particular generalization about the ways in which consonants need to be parsed into different syllables in order to get the stress system to work out. And it turns out that the way you need to parse those consonants into syllables exactly mirrors what kinds of consonant sequences are and are not allowed at the beginnings and ends of words in Latin. So that was a really valuable exercise because it allowed us to use stress as an independent test, a diagnostic for which syllable consonants are falling in. And then we looked at phonotactic constraints, right? So if Latin doesn't allow kt clusters at the beginning of a word, then we would expect that when they appear internal to a word, the first consonant k would have to be parsed into the preceding syllable as a coda. That means that syllable should pattern as heavy, and that makes predictions about the stress system. Compare that to a br sequence, which can occur at the beginning of a word in Latin. And so if that shows up in the middle of a word, we would expect both consonants to be parsed into the onset of the following syllable, and the preceding syllable should not necessarily be heavy, and that makes a different prediction about the stress system. In Latin, those two kinds of predictions seem to agree with each other perfectly, and that constitutes really strong support for the theory of syllables as doing something useful in Latin, right? So it helps us unify our account of what kinds of consonants are allowed to appear where in the language and how stress is assigned. Here are some data from the Hayes textbook, and there's a little bit of ambiguity in the handout. I refer to this as Palestinian Arabic here, but then later on the Hayes text refers to it as classical Arabic. My understanding from the textbook is that this is classical Arabic, but as spoken in the Levant, in Palestine and Lebanon. So it's some sort of modern rendering of classical Arabic. I think these stress facts are generally pretty similar in most Levantine varieties of Arabic. And so what do we find here? Well, basically, stress is going to be predictable in this variety of Arabic, but it still varies in its location based on the phonological structure of words. And in particular, we find one set of words with anti-penultimate stress, so third from last, and a bunch of these words are shown in this left column here. A different set of words here has penultimate stress on the second to last syllable. And then finally, there's the one-syllable words. Just as we saw in the earlier examples we looked at, one-syllable words are stressed on their one syllable. That means we're going to need to use this parenthesis notation in order to deal with this system. And so to try to figure out what's going on here, the way I've laid this out should make it clear there's a phonological generalization about the difference between these anti-penultimate stress words and these penultimate stress words. And a good way to start looking at this is to try to first sort of divorce the segmental content of the words from their syllabic shape. And so a good way to do that is to use symbols for different kinds of syllables, right? So Hayes starts by syllabifying all of these forms and then rewriting them in terms of their weight. And so what you can see here is that none of the words in this particular variety of Arabic begin with consonant clusters. And that suggests that anytime you have a sequence of two consonants in here, you're going to want to put the first consonant into the coda of the preceding syllable and the second consonant into the onset of the following syllable. So if you follow that algorithm, for instance, for this word safartu or safartu, I traveled, what you find here is you'll end up with three syllables, right? So each syllabic sound, and u, projects a syllable. And then you parse as many consonants into the onset as you can. Here, you can parse the t into an onset because it's a possible word beginning, but apparently rt is not a possible word beginning in classical Arabic, and so the r gets parsed into the preceding syllable. Now what we can see is that this is going to be a heavy syllable because it has a long vowel. This will be a heavy syllable because it has a coda consonant. And this will be a light syllable because it has only an onset consonant and a vowel. There's no second part of the syllable rhyme here. And so the way that we're going to notate this is with the so-called macron and breve notation. This is from classical Latin verse, but all that's important here is that the dash means heavy syllable, and this little loop thing means light syllable. So we'd represent this word as dash dash loop. And we go through and do this for each of the words in this data set. Here's what we get. Right now we can sort of see generalizations in terms of syllable weight rather than segmental content. Right. So there's, first of all, the final stress word, which it presumably doesn't matter whether that's a heavy or light syllable at all. It's just that stress goes on whatever syllable's there. Again, two-syllable words here in S and T, we see that the syllable weight pattern doesn't matter here. If you have a two-syllable word, you stress the first syllable regardless. And it's going to be the greater than two-syllable words that we're really interested in here. This is where the phonological action is. Okay, so what do we see here? Well, if we look, ignoring S and T for the moment, just look at this column, do we see anything in common here? And this little vertical pipe mark is marking the stress. So the next syllable here, the second to last one, is stressed. So one thing that immediately pops up here for the penultimate stress words, except for S and T, which we're going to ignore for the moment because they're only two syllables. For the greater than two syllable words, here the final syllables are all light, and the penultimate syllables, which are stressed, are all heavy. Take a look now at these anti-penultimate forms. And in final position, we get a mix of light syllables and heavy syllables. So that doesn't seem to be what's determining anti-penultimate stress. In penultimate position, looking down here, we get light, 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 and light, 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 light. So all of the anti-penultimate syllables in here, excuse me, all of the penultimate syllables in here, the second from last, are light syllables, whereas in the penultimate column here, all of the second to last syllables here are heavy. So we now have discovered the difference between anti-penultimate and penultimate stress words in classical Arabic. Again, looking to the anti-penultimate syllable that's stressed here, these ones are all light, but over here we find a mix of light and heavy, so that doesn't seem to be the property that's predicting anti-penultimate stress. It's really about the penultimate syllable. So what we can say here is that for words with more than two syllables, if the second from last syllable is heavy, then stress that syllable. Otherwise, stress the third from last syllable, the anti-penultimate. So this is actually the same as the Latin stress rule. This is exactly the pattern that we found in Latin when we looked there earlier. In Latin, we saw that heavy penults attracted stress, but if there was no heavy syllable in penultimate position, then you stress the anti-penultimate syllable in words with more than two syllables. So this is actually Arabic stress working exactly like Latin stress, which is kind of interesting because the two languages obviously are not related by any family or genetic affiliation. So this is the system. It's a very common pattern across language families, actually. It's not just Arabic and Latin that show this pattern. It's actually fairly common across the world's languages. And how are we going to analyze this in our Hayes system? Remember, we're treating stress as a feature, and then the distribution of that feature is being governed by structural properties of words, how many syllables they have, and in this case, what the weight of those syllables is. And there's going to be sort of a bunch of choice points in here, right? We have, if there's only one syllable, stress it. If there's only two syllables, then stress the first one. And if there's more than two syllables and the second one is heavy, then stress that. And otherwise, if you've gotten through all those choice points and you haven't assigned stress yet, then stress the anti-penultimate syllable as a kind of elsewhere condition. And so to do these choices within the Hayes theory, we're going to need the parenthesis notation that we introduced last time. Here, this is going to be a more complex application of that because there's more choices. So here's what Hayes sees as the longest expansion. This is going to be essentially the elsewhere condition, except it happens kind of in reverse order here. Right? And so in general, the longest expansion is going to be counting three syllables from the word edge. And this holds as long as there's 1, 2 syllables following the target. And the second to last, the penultimate syllable is light. Right? So it says, well, here's the longest expansion. Stress a syllable if it's followed by a light syllable, then followed by another syllable at the word boundary. That is, stress the anti-penultimate syllable if the penult is light and there's at least 3 syllables. Now, the next longest expansion is going to be cases where we have counting 2 syllables from the word boundary, and that's going to hold for both words that only have 2 syllables, as well as for words that don't meet this structural condition that do have more than 2 syllables. So if you have more than 2 syllables, how do you fail to meet the structural condition? Well, you must have at least 2 syllables here following the target one, but this one can't be light, otherwise the longest expansion would apply, so it must be heavy. So this statement, the second longest expansion here, is going to capture all of those cases. If you only have 2 syllables, then you scan to look for this context, it's not there, right? So you move on to the next one. If you have at least 3 syllables, but the second to last, the penultimate syllable is heavy, then you scan for this configuration. You don't find it because it doesn't meet this light penult criterion. So you move to the next one and you stress the penultimate syllable. Right? And then finally, if you don't meet either of these conditions, if you don't even have a syllable following the target at the end of the word, then you must be a one-syllable word, and the lone syllable should be stressed. We need to prioritize these different operations in order. Right? So we need to have an order of operations. First look for the longest one, next look for the next longest one, and last look for the shortest one. Hayes sort of lists this as a flow chart in some sense. Right? We're going to first look for this context, and then next look for this one. This is the longest and the second longest. Prioritizing this, but then getting this next, we can put a parenthesis around the light symbol here. So first try the one with the light penult, and if that doesn't work, then leave this out and look for it without the light penult. And then the shortest one here is going to be just the situation where you only have one syllable. And how do we get from this to that? Well, we put parentheses around everything else in the context as well. We say, well, after you're done looking for these two, then try it without anything in between the target and the word boundary. That is, try it for the final syllable. And so we put parentheses around everything else. Now we have nested parentheses. You can see this parenthesis notation allows us to characterize some pretty complex choices here. The final form of the rule is going to look like this, where it says syllables in classical Arabic are predictably stressed if they, first of all, precede a light penult and then a final syllable, or if that doesn't work, then they just precede a final syllable, or if that doesn't work, then they just precede a word boundary. That's what that rule basically says. If we were doing this like our Latin example that we did earlier, the final thing to do here would be to confirm that the syllabifications we use to make this stress rule work are the same ones that we need to describe the phonotactics of the language, right? So is it the case that where we need to put a syllable break in between two consonants in order to get the stress facts right, is it true that rta is not a possible word beginning in Arabic? We'd ask the same for every other sequence of consonants that shows up here in this context. In particular, we would want to check whether, I guess, rata is really the only one that we have here, which is kind of interesting. And so we'd probably need a wider range of data to really check whether these two sets of facts match up. And it turns out in the end that actually word initial consonant clusters tend to be a little bit complicated in many varieties of Arabic. So it differs a lot in different varieties of Arabic, what kinds of consonant sequences are allowed at the beginning of a word, and in fact, whether any such sequences are allowed at all differs between varieties. And then it's also often complicated by morphological factors. So in some varieties of Arabic, you can get very, very complex and difficult consonant clusters at the beginnings of words, but only with certain kinds of prefixes or something like that. So we're not going to go through all those steps for Arabic, but originally there was a homework assignment for this unit dealing with the American Indian language Klamath. I'm going to split that out into a short separate video here that deals with Klamath stress because it's related to these issues and reaches a really interesting conclusion about syllabification and stress. So that's going to be a short extra video that I'll post in a moment, and then we'll finish up this handout in a separate mini video looking at English stress. Okay.